I'm really pleased to have Cindy Rizzo here. She's Vice President at ARCUS Foundation for Social Justice. She's been a long-term advocate for LGBT rights and civil rights in general worldwide. She's very well known in the community, and we're just, and I've known her for a number of years. I'm just thrilled to have her here to talk about the long and deep history of LGBT civil rights struggle and what we learned from the civil rights movement. And then we're tying that right into our discussion on Black racism. And we have today Gabriel Maldonado, who I think many of you may know, who's CEO of TruEvolution, and a powerful voice. And I'm introducing them together because Cindy's going to speak at first, and then Gabriel's going to move in, and I can see them interacting, and I don't want to break them up when as they make their transition. But if you need help with the transition, raise your hand. I'll help you with it. Okay. So Cindy, please welcome and go forth and prosper. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for that nice introduction. I really appreciate it. As Stephen said, I am the Vice President for the Social Justice Program at the ARCUS Foundation, which is a private foundation with a living donor. And we work in two main areas, conservation and social justice for LGBTQ people. And the work is in the US, but also in regions outside the US. I've been involved in LGBTQ work for many, many years as a volunteer, as a board member, as a staff person, as someone working at organizations and in philanthropy. So I'm going to give you, so what I thought I'd do is talk to you about some of what people see as sort of the big wins on LGBT work, marriage, the non-discrimination, HIV work, and the elimination of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And those are sort of at the sort of legislative, public education levels, sort of at the highest levels. But then I want to talk really more and bring it down to the grassroots and some of the issues that those big wins haven't been able to cover sufficiently, and really talk about how that all gets us to the moment that we're in right now. So that's kind of an overview of where I'm going to go. And I want to begin by telling you that I just recently had the opportunity to watch, I think it was about a 12-minute video in black and white that was covering the very first, what we called at the time, gay rights march in New York City in 1970. So it was a year after the Stonewall Rebellion. And the journalists that did this, made this video, you know, showed a multiplicity of people who were participating and on the sidelines and at the rally that ended that year in Central Park. And what I really took away from it was how even then, just a year after Stonewall, you could really see people sort of self-selecting in two ways. One was a more sort of assimilationist, we want to be accepted, we don't want to be too out there, we want really people to understand who we are. And a more edgy, sort of more radical kind of, we want to change everything, we want to change the system, we want to be who we are in a sort of out there way. So those kind of early divisions really marked the beginning of the movement, and even before Stonewall. But it was just so interesting to see coverage of a demonstration. Divisions were still very clearly present and really last into today. So let me talk about some of the big issues first that people think about when they think about the LGBT movement. And it was very interesting recently, there's been a debate now that the Supreme Court not only ruled on marriage equality in 2015, but now recently in this month's decision where they found that Title VII, which is a federal law that protects against sex discrimination in employment, that the term sex covers sexual orientation and gender identity, so that people can now file for covered across the United States and protected against employment discrimination, or at least have a remedy when they feel they have been discriminated against. So, you know, these are very big wins, and there's no debate about that. But what really sort of touched out a debate recently was a column by the conservative gay writer Andrew Sullivan saying this is the end of the movement. This is the end of LGBT rights in the US, you know, pack up and go home, and a mission accomplished. And many have written in opposition to that point of view, saying that there's still so much work to do, especially when you think about the rates of violence against trans women of color, especially, and the war on trans people that the Trump administration has pursued since its very early days after the inauguration. Plus, there are also many other issues that have gone unattended that those big wins haven't covered. And many people refer to those as the sort of lived reality of people. So let me talk about what I think really helped make the big wins happen. And I always give, when I talk about these issues publicly, I always give a good example for me is the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was an effort to try to sort of by baby steps help LGBT people or gay people really be in the military. But basically it was sort of, you can go in the military, we won't ask you if you're homosexual, but you can't tell anyone about it. And if you do, and it comes to our attention, we will discharge you. So it was kind of a thanks, no thanks kind of law that was passed in the early 90s, in the early days of the Bill Clinton administration. And so obviously that was you know, a terrible step backward. And what happened in trying to get rid of that bill, and it was successful in overturning that law, was a real effort by many different parts of the LGBT movement to attack that law and pass a good law in a lot of different ways. And it's a very symbolic story about how a movement works, even when it's not coordinated, even when the parts aren't coordinated. So you had the people on the inside, the advocates from places like Human Rights Campaign and some of the military organizations like Service Members Legal Defense Network. And those were people that were lobbying Congress and talking to folks within the administration in the early days of the Obama administration, trying to get Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed. And so they were doing their thing. Then you had the communications people led by a think tank in California that was really trying to move public opinion on this. And they were working by educating service members, speaking at West Point. Aaron Belkin was the leader of that group. He would go to West Point and speak to the cadets about LGBT service. And also they recruited very visible members of the military leadership to write op-eds and have them published in the mainstream media. So you had John Kelly Bush, I can't say his last name and I apologize for that, but he was a Joint Chiefs of Staff head, and a general who wrote about the fact that he was for equal military service. So you had the sort of public relations aspect of it, high numbers in polling of people in the general public saying we accept openly gay and openly trans military members. And then you had the outsiders, the people that chained themselves to the White House fence, who were advocating for this in a whole different way, pushing from without. So you had the insiders, you had the public education people, and you had the outsiders. And I think all of that came together, even though they would argue with each other and they would say that it was their work that made this happen, but it really was a confluence of all their efforts. And I would say that about really all of the big wins. The marriage win also, certainly the LGBT movement has an incredibly sophisticated and diverse legal sector of organizations that work very well together. And you know, as you know, the marriage win was a legal win. There were two decisions, one that got rid of the Defense of Marriage Act so that people in states where the legislature had allowed for marriage equality also were able to get federal rights. And then there was the big Obergefell decision that established marriage equality throughout the country. And obviously the legal folks and the leaders in that aspect of the movement were very influential in making that happen. But there was also a whole other aspect to it. Really trying to ongoing research about what messages would really move the public's point of view and opinion about the need for marriage equality. So in the early days, there was a lot of messaging about the legal rights and we should be equal and all of that. And then they realized when numbers of states passed referenda outlawing marriage equality, that messaging just wasn't moving the needle on the public acceptance. And so they went to a whole different messaging, which they tested, which was about love. And the idea that people really, you know, had these long-term relationships and loved each other and were building families and really deserved the same rights as their heterosexual counterparts. And that seemed to be a message that really got through to people. And there was one effort in Massachusetts to turn back the decision that started all of this in 2007, where the Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court in the state, should be allowed, and a effort to turn it back. And one of the really successful aspects of that campaign was this idea of people coming forward and saying, the nice gay couple next door to us always plows our driveway, or people help us in our neighborhood who are openly gay. And those kinds of stories about real relationships and real lives of LGBT people helped quite a bit. And that same strategy was used later on when Massachusetts had another statewide referenda campaign around adding gender identity to its public accommodations law. So there's been a lot of different efforts, and I guess what I would say about what made the big pieces, the big wins successful is sort of a multi-dimensional strategy, even when it wasn't coordinated among its parts, that really helped move public opinion, legislature, and the pushing of activists from the outside in. So that's my sense of that. And you can also extend that into the movement of ACT UP and many folks who worked in HIV services and advocacy over the time that people were really trying to make sure that people with HIV, you know, could live and that the government would provide resources for all of the organizations that were out that had cropped up from within the LGBT community to help and serve people with HIV. So let me move on to what didn't happen, what the big wins didn't cover. And I guess what we would say at the ARCUS Foundation is that it really didn't help what we call in many ways the lived experience of people, what people's daily lives were like, especially those who are most marginalized in the LGBT community. And so you start with transgender folks who felt that their, you know, the way they experience violence, the way they have very unequal opportunities for employment and education and all manner of safety in their lives, and certainly to transitional health care. All of that was not covered by the big wins. And so you extend that into other folks who are marginalized and have intersectional identities, certainly people of color, and then you look at trans women of color who are the most susceptible to all kinds of violence, both the kind that is about stranger violence, intimate partner violence, and violence by police and other state actors. So when you look at those kinds of lived experiences, you realize that the work of the LGBTQ movement is far from complete, and that there needs to be much more done to address those people at the margins, because, you know, as people smarter than me said, no one is free till we're all free. And I think that's really very important. And what we're seeing now, and so what I think is that, you know, the professional insider strategy and the legal work gets you so far. But then there's really the issue of what the grassroots, what's going on at the grassroots and what's going on in local communities, and how people who are experiencing the problems are in the best position to really articulate and identify the solutions to those problems. And I think that's where the LGBT movement is right now, or much of it is right now. No one is following the idea, the Andrew Sullivan idea, that we can close up shop and say we won everything. That's far from where things are at. And I think right now what we're seeing in terms of the racial justice work that Stephen mentioned, and the issue of really addressing anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism, is about a movement moment. And these things didn't just happen because, you know, one man, George Floyd, was murdered in a horrible way, and the video was available to show how he was murdered. Certainly that was a catalyst, but really many, many people worked for many years and decades, even when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement and all those who were working against racial justice, to be able to mobilize when their moment came, when the movement moment came. And those who study social justice movements really have shown how those are very important moments that people have, that movements have to work toward in order to take advantage of those opportunities. So I will stop there and let Gabriel take it from that point. And if, you know, there are questions or any kind of dialogue, I'm very happy to engage at that level too.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Wow. You know, if you don't know where you come from and you don't know the history of the work that we do, there's no way for us to be able to lay tracks for the foundation forward. And, you know, as you're kind of recounting the history of the LGBT movement, I'm remembering the first time that I ever came to Riverside. So my name is Gabriel Maldonado. I am the founder and CEO of TruEvolution. I was originally born and raised in Compton, California. And so my experiences with racial justice and racial issues and anti-Blackness and racism took on a very real effect for me at a very young age. But I came to Riverside County, specifically to UCR in 2007. And if anyone remembers what was happening in 2007, it was the onset of Proposition 8 campaign. And I remember as a freshman driving my little Ford Explorer from Los Angeles to Riverside to start undergrad and check into my dorm apartment. I remember exiting, for those of you that are familiar with the region and geography, I exited off of Martin Luther King, and on the corner of MLK and Canyon Crest, I was met with my first sign that says, "God hates faggots." And that was my introduction to Riverside, was that God hates faggots. And it was then at that moment, like Cindy says, when the movement moment happens and it kind of just rises up in you that something needs to be done. And you don't really know what. And I think a lot of advocates and activists, we don't always have the answers right when we kick off the movement. But we know that our own lived experiences and the lived experiences of those who look like us and share our stories are being attacked. And what do we do? And how do we respond? I have always felt that the first step to anti-racism and the first step to combating specifically anti-Blackness that exists within racism is the self-determination of Black people. And when we as Black people are unable to access the social, political, and economic opportunity in a way that it is uninhibited, in a way that is equitable, in a way that is just, when we are unable to do that, then certain things like when I go to get healthcare, or when I go to enroll my kid into school, or when I walk to go get Skittles wearing a hoodie down the street, or when I get pulled over for a police simple traffic ticket, that there isn't a predisposition and a preset of prejudices and biases and assumptions that may result in an outcome for me that is very different than my white counterparts. And so that's where, that's where real justice begins, is allowing people to be able to determine their own destinies. And that was sort of the birthing genesis of TruEvolution, is this idea of advocating for people of color. LGBT people of color has been our focus, to be able to determine their own destinies. I will share something very interesting, and it is because something that really endears me to the Caravanserai Project is that both Stephen and Mihai really started off their work talking about systems of power, and how power and power dynamics play a role in the building of institutions, in the building of community, in the changing of systems, and the advancement of policies. And in the early days of TruEvolution, for probably the first 5 to 6 years, it was very difficult in Riverside County to get anyone, any funder, any type of giving body, any type of institution, the national funders, the big funders nationally. It was very difficult in 2007 for the first 5 to 6 years to get anyone to care about a small, county or a small city in California, where the assumption is that we have access to all the resources that we need to create social change. And that's interesting because I'm pulling up the 2008 California Proposition 8 results, and it shows that Riverside County voted at 64% and San Bernardino voted 66% in favor of Proposition 8. And that just shows you kind of the mindset and the perspective, or the lack of understanding of my community. And when you compound that with a barrier to be able to resource yourself, to be able to build institutions, to be able to build power movements, to be able to mobilize systems, they go hand in hand, not just the attitudes of people, but the investments of the institutions in your community. So for the first 5 years, our organization focused largely on, grassroots advocacy. We were one of the first agencies to lead a change in the city of Riverside's charter, which at the time, back in 2008, 2009, still referred to Asian Americans as Orientals, referred to African Americans as Negroes, and had no reference to women in any way, shape, or form, and used largely patriarchal vocabulary. And so we fought really hard to get things like that changed, these sort of, what now I look back to say as these symbolic type of changes with, language and systems, and, getting diversity liaisons appointed in the mayor's office and creating task forces. And that was great. That was a great first 5 years. What I recognized very early on is that the people that I was trying to mobilize and the community that I was trying to bring together to coalesce around these issues, we were starting off at a disadvantage with so many other disparities that it was very difficult for us to even come together. I mean, we were suffering from employment. We had young people that were experiencing domestic violence and rape and sexual assault. You have children that are engaged in sex work at early ages like 16 and 17, substance abuse, both in the home and in yourself, and mental health issues. And, that became very clear to me in the first 5 years of the organization. And I recognized that we cannot just have advocacy standing alone, but it also needs to be the investment of resources and access and services and programs that uplift the community. And so in 2011, we diversified ourselves and became a service provider. In 2014, we really jumped deep into direct services. And so today, we have a mental health clinic, we have an emergency housing program, we have HIV care and prevention services. And that has been one of my attempts to be able to equip my population with the tools to determine their own destinies, the self-determination of my people. And if people can be housed, if folks can have food in their stomachs, if people can have access to their doctors, if people can be able to have a community that receives them in their fullness, if these kind of basic fundamentals about respecting and acknowledging our human dignity, if that can be the foundation in how we look at all people and how we address the inequities that have existed so long in Black and Brown communities, then I think that's the first step that we take into addressing racism in our community. And it can't just be the advocacy. It can't just be the symbolic gestures. You know, it can't just be the webinars and, you know, the titles and, you know, the spaces. Okay, it's not just spaces. Spaces is where it begins. It's not where it ends. And so for me, you know, I think that the work begins with acknowledging that there is a real investment that needs to take place. And I think that that first begins with the investment of institutions of color. And that's my bias, maybe. So forgive me if that's my bias in saying that. But, you know, I believe that there are so many amazing organizations led by people of color, led by the LGBT community that deserve and need our investment. You know, and I think for many of you, I see a lot of the colleagues that are on, some of you are in foundations and many of you are in giving bodies, or you may sit on boards that influence the giving of funds. You know, and I think it's important as funders to recognize that there is a very real sense of power dynamics that we as grant recipients experience. Whether we have permission to tell our funder that their funding priorities are not fully in alignment with what the community is saying. How do we say that? How do we communicate that without being offensive? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't negate us from future funding investment? And I think that that's the role that us here in this conversation can play when it comes to the investing and supporting of institutions. And that's the framework that I come from, because, you know, I look to, you know, the Ahmad Institute in Watts, or In the Meantime in Los Angeles, or Abounding Prosperity in Dallas, Texas, or, you know, us helping us in Washington, D.C., or Aid Atlanta in Atlanta, Georgia. And I look at these institutions as vehicles for being able to lead these movements, for being able to help give a self-determination to their people, to be able to realize our own dreams and actualize our own lives. And I look at us, grassroots organizations, I look at us as the vehicles for that. And I also look at us as the leading vehicles for building power and creating power movements and doing community organizing. So those are my initial thoughts that came to my mind, and how the organization TruEvolution came to be, and what does it look like to invest in addressing anti-Blackness and broadly racism in the country. And for me, that looks like in the investment in institutions that are for us and by us. And I'm going to pause there, see if Cindy wants to come in. Stephen, I don't know if you have any other questions that you think we might want to tease out some thoughts.
You know, I was really struck, Gabriel, by, I think, a really exciting kind of account you gave of your organization. But what was really interesting to me was so many service organizations focus on their direct service work. And as Stephen said in his introduction, really don't understand the importance and the power of using advocacy in expanding into advocacy spaces. And it seems like your organization went in the opposite direction. You started with advocacy, and then you realized the need and the importance of expanding into direct services. And I just find that fascinating that you began in the opposite way that many organizations go in the other direction.
Well, you know, that's interesting. It's actually kind of been one of my biggest gripes, I'll say. And the gripe is that, and I'll just be frank, because Stephen said to be direct. You know, a lot of the foundations, the big foundations, you know, when I look at their giving priorities, and I look at how they give, and I look at what institutions they give to, they give largely to organizations that focus on policy, advocacy, systems change. Like that is the largest part of their work, and they're known for that work. And I actually think that there's a really big missed opportunity in that when you just only fund primarily those institutions, because a lot of us who work in direct services, we have day-to-day essential contact with the communities that we're trying to mobilize. And there's sort of a reciprocity with our clients, because we're not just serving them, but they're not just coming to be an advocacy resource to us, but we are providing direct service to them. And there is this kind of reciprocity that exists, and there's this intimacy that happens between a direct service provider and its constituency. And I think that mobilization and community organizing, there is such an opportunity inside of direct service agencies to build and expand these movements just by nature of how connected we are to the communities that we're trying to mobilize. There's a very deep intimacy when you have 5 support groups a week, and the same person is walking in 2 to 3 times a week to get mental health services, or the person that you're housing, offering emergency housing to. That is a very, deep relationship that can be actualized and mobilized into systems change work. And, I'll be honest with you that change came by survival. It came as survival. And there is a whole lot more resources in direct service work than there is sustainable resources in direct service work, than there is in advocacy. Particularly in advocacy, the most you might get is a 2 to 3 year multi-year grant that might support 3 people, 4 people, and direct services has really been a vehicle that's allowed us as an institution to survive, to grow, to have a sustainable foundation. And, so I'm a really big advocate for really uplifting the work of direct service providers who also have advocacy work. And I think it could be a real necessary thing for us to figure out ways that we can better support those institutions.
Yeah. No, a number of years ago, I did a grant at ARCUS for Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, which is the largest AIDS service provider in the city, and it was to help really fuse together the direct service work and the data and information they get and the relationships they get from that direct service work with their advocacy, so that you move from a tactic to a more grassroots and constituent-based advocacy. And I think that that's really much richer and much more, it puts you in a better position for success when you have the people directly impacted really coming and telling their stories and advocating for themselves and their communities.
I think there's quite a bit of research too that tells us that the most true advocacy is direct services, and that people who do direct services are better advocates just because of what you're saying. Gabriel, I had a question for you, Gabriel. So people said, oh, Pride and Prejudice, cute name for the webinar, but it's kind of a cute name, but we did want to talk about pride and what we'd learned from the gay community. But on the word prejudice, it's a weak word in today's vocabulary. But when you talk about all the power struggles, I understand that, and we've got to see power shift for anything to happen. But Cindy was talking about the day and the life that we all live, and the threats and the fears that we all live with, and so it comes to that racism or that prejudice. And so when we talk about direct services and the way we do advocacy, how does our outcomes from that actually impact prejudice? How do we reduce prejudice in our society? And so those outcomes from all the stuff that we're talking about, how do they actually impact that?
Yeah. I am a child of James Baldwin. I have his photo right up there to remind me of what I do. And, James Baldwin spoke once on the Dick Cavett show, and he says, I may not know what's in the heart of white Americans, but I know the state of their institutions. And I think when I think of prejudice, I think of attitude. I think of, what is happening in a person's heart. And I think it's very difficult as a Black man. It's very difficult as an Afro-Latino. It's very difficult as a gay man for me to make decisions, choices, and to feel a sense of safety in my own world based on what may or may not believe in the hearts of my countrymen. And I think I start from the place of looking at the state of institutions. And like Cindy said, we've had all these progress in the LGBT movement, but we've also made progress in racial justice. Okay, I know I have a lot of my peers are like real diehard, like burn the system alive, and I'm with them on that, in some regards. But I also think that it's important that we recognize the progress that we have made. The challenge, though, Stephen, is that while justice has also evolved, oppression has also evolved as well.
Yeah.
We think that oppression and racism stayed static and that it looked like white hoods and it looks like nooses, which is scary that we are seeing nooses resurface themselves in places like Palmdale or in the African-American NASCAR race driver, I'm forgetting his name right now, that found a noose in his locker. And that those kind of images are kind of frightening that we're back to those symbols. But I recognize that oppression and racism has transformed itself. It's evolved and it's become incredibly insidious. And I think what is even more dangerous about prejudice and racism and biases is that it exists in the hearts of people who genuinely believe that they are standing on the right side of justice. And that is a very dangerous combination, that when people believe that they are actually doing the right thing, or people who say all lives matter, negating Black Lives Matter, really believing that they feel a true sense of justice in saying all lives matter. And there's a certainty in that. And I think that is more dangerous than the nooses. It's more dangerous than the overt racism. And so for me, I really look towards what has changed in the state of our institutions. And I'm also a public health junkie. I'm a public health official. So for me, I look at data. And when we look at the school to prison pipeline, when we look at the United States as having the largest prison system in the world, when we look at the state of the criminal justice system and the rates of death rates for African-American men, when we look at the infant mortality rates amongst Black women, and I think those kinds of things speak to the state of our institutions for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to thank both of you. It was just terrific, and you really had a lot for us to hear and learn today. So thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Gabriel, and thank all of you for attending today.